All right, so here we're back again looking at softwoods and hardwoods. This time it's in a tighter forest condition, so what you'd call full crown closure, meaning the trees are tight enough that they're shading each other out, and so their tendency is now to grow up as opposed to growing out like we saw in the open grown. So if we look behind me here, you can see some nice jack pine. They've got some branching still left, but all that there's nothing live on it. But you got long stems and then a crown restricted to the top. And this is pretty common for tight forest conditions, which is the norm for a lot of our forests. Is they're fully stocked, and so you've got competition. And with competition comes the need to grow and keep into the sun. So, you know, the survival of the fittest applies, where the strong trees get ahead of the others and you get self-thinning, and eventually you'll have a nicely spaced stand of tall straight trees like we see here with the softwoods. Okay, and then if we were to go into hardwoods over here, we can see the similar sort of trend, in that you've got like this poplar, a clean stem going up to a crown that's amongst all the other crowns. Okay, and one thing you do notice is the stems are much straighter, very little to any taper. And that's because they now have the protection of the stand around them, meaning the other trees, they act together, and so they protect each other from wind loads and stuff like that. And so there's not as much stress put on individual trees. The wind tends to hit the forest and fly over top of it, as opposed to blow right through it. Whereas in an open tree, the wind hits it on all sides, and so it has to react by creating wood and structures to accommodate that. In the forest you don't, and this is the type of wood from an industrial point of view that we're looking for, because it creates long straight trees, minimum knots, and minimum taper. So it's much higher quality, and under these conditions trees tend to grow a little bit slower because of competition. In an open grown they don't, so they grow very rapidly, and as we'll discuss later in other courses like my wood science, that rapid growth severely affects wood properties and wood quality. Okay, so the root systems in these trees too maybe not be as intense as an open grown, because again the stress on the tree is less, so it allocates more of its resources to above ground growth, meaning apical growth and stem growth, because it does not have any loads or stresses put on it that lets the tree know it needs to produce more intense root systems. Okay, this is actually a cutover through the center, which is why it's a good opportunity to see a cross section, if you will, of the forest showing the stand without being actually in it. Okay, so for now we'll stop here, and then we're going to go stand in the middle of a stand so you can actually see what that looks like from underneath. Okay, all right, so now we're inside the stand. We were just standing outside looking at it from the edge, so we're standing right in the middle of it. And the one thing you'll notice, this is an older stand. We're in a bit of an opening here, but it's not uncommon as stands mature that you'll see certain trees dying back and other trees maintaining. So you get something that started off with a super high stand density that eventually brings itself down to a more reasonable density, as we can see here. And as we look up, we can see there's some trees that are dying back. They've been out-competed, and others that are doing well. You can see the crown is moved to the top. The branches, the dead branches along it, depending on species, will either self-prune or get knocked off, ideally. If they stay there, they become a defect when it comes to sawing lumber from them. But we'll discuss all that. And then if we look behind me, we can see the poplar stand, which also shows the difference between the open-grown hardwoods and the closed. Nice clean stems straight up, some dead branches, but they eventually fall. But you got that clean stem, same with the softwoods, very little to no taper. So the conditions of this causes a different type of growth, as opposed to trees growing to stabilize themselves in the open with a wide stem, lots of branches from the base of the tree to the top. Here you have a narrower stem, a clean bowl that looks like a telephone pole, and a crown that's restricted to the top as the trees strive to get more sunlight. Okay, so that's one of the big differences between open and closed, is the actual form and the structure of the tree, and then how they allocate resources, which we'll discuss in class as well. Okay, so I think that's about, that pretty much, maybe we'll do one quick pan around at ground level so you can see the stalking, how it changes, and then we'll pan around up in the crowns so you can see how the crowns have moved up. So one of the other things that we're going to discuss while we're in the closed sort of canopy here is certain trees are very adapted to being understory, while others are more adapted to being crown trees only. So things like jack pine, they grow well after a fire and they come up as the overstory. They don't typically grow well as an understory tree. Their tolerance for shade is not that high. Whereas if we get something like a balsam fir, they're very shade tolerant. They can sit in the understory for 40, 50 years being 3 or 4 feet tall, and when an opening occurs, they'll grow up through it. Spruces, they can slowly grow up underneath like a poplar forest, and they will eventually, when the poplars die, become the old trees. So you can see in here, we can see some balsam firs, and that pulling up from underneath, there's enough light for them to grow. Okay, they have a significant tolerance to shade. Whereas things like the pines, they typically don't. They need the open grown and they need to grow up like that. Okay, so there's different trees that we'll see in the understory, things like poplars and that, they can grow underneath. Some species do, some species don't. Okay, softwoods, in a pure softwood stand, there's typically not a lot in the understory because of the fact that softwoods acidify soils, and not a lot will grow under that full closed canopy. Hardwoods, because of there's more light penetration, you see multi-tiered levels in the understory of shade tolerant species, ones that are somewhat, and then there's levels of canopy. Softwoods, very typically in a full softwood, it's one species across large tracts of land with very little understory. Okay, and that's a difference, and that's, as foresters, or even if you're in the environmental, you need to understand how trees react to their environment and which trees are appropriate in which environments. So if you're planting, you want to make sure you put the best tree on the site that'll give you good quality and good growth that industry wants to use. If you're an environmental and you're looking for remediation, or if you're looking for water, dealing with water in areas, you're going to want to pick species that are either quite happy to be with their feet wet, or in areas where there may be toxins, ones that can absorb pollutants and store them. So knowledge about how different trees grow in different environments is very useful at all levels of what we teach in this program, right from professional forestry to environmental management. Okay, so understanding about these, how they react with other plants, how they react with, say, wildlife on the landscape, all these things become important. And so if you understand how trees grow and develop and where they're best and who uses them, it makes you a much better manager at the end of the day.